drugs, or ideas, what you consume influences who you become. On the Mind and Matter podcast, we learn together from the best scientists and thinkers alive today about how your mind-body reacts to what you feed it. Before starting Mind and Matter, I spent 10 years in academia doing scientific research. I got a PhD in neuroscience where I focused on neuroendocrinology and the neurobiology of behavior, and before that, I specialized in molecular, developmental, and evolutionary genetics. I use my scientific background to help parse and translate the information that guests share on the podcast. In addition to the podcast, I write long-form written content inspired by the show where I integrate what I've learned across episodes. I also have a free weekly newsletter where I provide you with upcoming guests, share links, and provide commentary on scientific studies and research that I'm reading, and more. Visit mindandmatter.substack.com to find all of my content. If you're getting value from this content, please consider becoming a paid subscriber to the Mind and Matter Substack. For just $5 a month, you'll get early access to episodes and other content, full episode transcripts, and I'll prioritize answering your questions in emails and the comments sections. You can also support me by checking out the links in the episode description to my affiliate partners who make various health and wellness products that I use and enjoy myself. You'll receive a discount and help support the podcast that way. And if you want the benefits of a paid subscription, but it's not in your budget, simply sign up for my free weekly newsletter, send me an email, and I'll give you a complimentary paid subscription. Word of mouth is the best way to help the podcast grow. So if you like what I'm doing, please share your favorite episodes with family and friends. The purpose of the podcast is to provide you with information obtained largely from primary sources, the people doing the research and producing new knowledge. This content is never meant to serve as medical advice. And with that, enjoy the episode. Hey everyone, I want to take just a minute to tell you about a really cool health monitoring device I've been using called Lumen. It's a handheld, pocket-sized device with a sleek design. The Lumen device measures CO2 levels in your breath, which allows their technology to determine the extent to which your body is burning fats versus carbohydrates. Lumen helps improve your metabolic flexibility, your body's efficiency in shifting between using fats and carbs for energy. I use this device in the morning or before bed or after meals or after workouts to track my metabolism. With just a couple weeks of use, I learned a lot about which foods were causing my body to burn mostly fat, mostly carbs, or both, as well as how long I needed to fast and how hard I needed to exercise to promote fat burning. Being able to track whether your body is burning fat versus carbs will help you figure out how your body responds to your lifestyle and whether or not your weight loss and fitness strategies are actually working. Lumen is great for anyone looking to optimize their health for either weight loss or athletic performance. Their easy-to-use app allows you to track your results together with what you're eating and how you're exercising, and it syncs with other devices like the Apple Watch. Click the link in the episode description to learn more and use the code MINDMATTER, MINDMATTER, to get 10% off your Lumen device today. That's on top of the site-wide sale they are currently running, and the Lumen device is eligible to be paid for with FSA and HSA health accounts. Check out the link in the episode description for more info.
Hartig. I'm an associate professor of medicine and cell biology at Baylor College of Medicine in Houston, Texas. I've been at Baylor since 2008, and I have a non-conventional ascension through the system. In contrast to a lot of people we recruit from the outside, I survived an inside track to where I am today. So I was a postdoctoral fellow here, and then was promoted to an entry-level faculty position. And I was fortunate enough to secure funding independently, and that allowed me to establish my research laboratory. In my laboratory, since about 2009, when I was a postdoctoral fellow, has been focused on the cell biology of fat cells. And we've been interested in understanding, number one, how fat cells respond to external signals and how they turn those external signals into mechanisms that are important for storing energy and disposing of energy. And this is really important for physiology in mammals because adipose tissue is the reservoir for storing energy when we need it, not just during times when food's not available, but also to liberate energy during infection.
Mm,
In adipose tissue and fat cells, it gets sort of a bad reputation because it's mostly associated with obesity and being overweight. However, adipose tissue is this really cool endocrine organ too. It's not just important for storing energy, it's also really fundamentally vital for regulating glucose metabolism.
hmm,
People that lack adipose tissue have conditions called lipodystrophies, and they develop similar syndromes as people with type 2 diabetes.
really?
Yes,
So people basically might have, say, a genetic condition where they completely lack fat tissue or fat cells, and they basically have a disrupted endocrine system.
yes. So they develop these individuals have insulin resistance and diabetes conditions that are oftentimes worse than people who have obesity and type 2 diabetes.
Hmm.
Um, and in fact, there's been a number of studies from prominent journals like Cell Metabolism that demonstrated people that have lipodystrophies and are of low BMI, low body mass index, they're at a greater risk of conditions like liver cancer than people who are obese.
Hmm.
So this concept that adipose tissue is important for regulating metabolism in the whole body is really founded in important principles that are related to how much adipose tissue that you accumulate in the body and where it's stored. And so my lab is interested in understanding what are the properties of fat cells that produce those metabolic benefits in animal models and in people.
Hmm. So obviously, when people think about healthy levels of fat on the body, we tend to think about, not having too much. And, you can understand why. It's pretty obvious why we have an obesity epidemic. But it sounds like if you go in the other direction, if your body fat's too low, that's also problematic. And as you mentioned, those conditions where people don't have any body fat, but they still have develop type 2 diabetes and insulin resistance. I guess that also is one way to show us that even though obesity and diabetes often go hand in hand, they are in fact dissociable.
They are. They are. There's a fairly sizable population of people in this country in, who have obesity, yet have normal measures of insulin sensitivity and glucose levels and serum lipids. And those people have a predisposition or a propensity for storing fat in subcutaneous depots, so places like
Mm,
the buttocks and in the thighs. It's unclear right now whether these types of metabolically healthier forms of obesity are a transient state, but there is a large population of people where this appears to be a long-term adaptation or perhaps buried in genetics somehow.
hmm. And so subcutaneous fat, that would be in contrast to visceral fat. Can you explain the difference there for people?
Subcutaneous fat is the adipose tissue that's underneath the skin, and it's actually the largest um, depot for adipose tissue. So 80% of your fat cells are located in subcutaneous depots. Visceral fat is the adipose tissue that's accumulating in the intra-abdominal space. And it's thought that when subcutaneous fat reaches its maximal storage potential, that's when you start to see spillover of energy that's stored in abdominal fat tissue. And um, abdominal fat is really the adipose tissue depot that's predictive of cardiometabolic disease and insulin resistance. Um, it's also associated with uh, fatty liver disease and insulin resistance. And what's interesting is that in a number of animal studies, These two depots arise from completely different cellular lineages. The lineage for subcutaneous fat is coming from the mesoderm, whereas visceral fat comes from a completely different origin that's related to sort of nearer to the mesothelial cell of origin.
So these aren't just, when we say visceral versus subcutaneous fat, it's not merely a description of different locations where fat can go anatomically speaking. These are completely different cells that belong to different lineages of the body.
Yes, they are, for lack of a better description, they are different organs
Hmm.
and they behave differently. They all respond to anabolic hormones like insulin, but their behavior is quite different. And that's really, a fundamental question that we would like to understand in our lab is what makes them different, what makes them the same, and when does adipose tissue ultimately become bad?
Mm-hmm.
And that's really at the heart of all the questions that we want to try to understand in my lab.
Mm-hmm. And when we think about, so you said, when does adipose tissue become bad? I think that the naive way people think about fat is that um, it's bad when you have too much of it, which implies that if you just keep stacking, more and more fat cells on top of each other or filling them up with more fat, at some point we just draw a line in the sand and we say that's too much. But I'm wondering if there's more to it than that. Does the actual like physiology, the actual functional stuff that the fat cells are doing, does that change in a state of obesity or in a state of diabetes or in a different metabolic state? Does it actually change like inside the person at some point and start, these fat cells start doing different things?
Yes, there's a wide breadth of knowledge that suggests that that's precisely true, that in states of excess energy that adipose tissue changes and loses its ability to store glucose-derived carbon as lipid efficiently. There's also, a lot of really nice evidence that suggests that the size of the fat cell is really predictive of, um, metabolic declines in function. So if your subcutaneous fat has more smaller adipocytes, that actually provides greater surface area for storing energy more efficiently.
Mm.
As in abdominal fat depots where you have larger fat cells, those are generally associated with glucose intolerance and insulin resistance. And those larger fat cells, despite being bigger, actually store energy less efficiently.
Hmm.
And so those are really, important differences between how adipose tissue responds and ultimately how it predicts metabolic consequences of obesity.
In a lean, metabolically healthy person, what are the different types of fat cells? So we talked about subcutaneous
Yeah.
versus visceral, and that those are different. They're not just anatomical differences being referred to there. But what about like white and brown fat? Are there different, like very different types or distinct types of fat cells that have very different physiological functions?
Yes, this is a very pointed matter in the field, and there are different shades of adipose tissue. And right now, there's a belief that at least three exist, and those three are white fat, brown fat, and then what's called beige fat.
Hmm.
And white fat is the type of adipose tissue that has the greatest familiarity. It's mostly implicated with the consequences of obesity. Brown fat is an adipose tissue depot that is important for generating heat in rodents. It performs thermogenesis, which is the process of generating heat in response to cold and thermogenic stimuli. Beige fat is a newer form of adipose tissue that was identified, and this is a type of adipose tissue that is not purely brown fat and not purely white fat, but expresses many features of both.
Hmm.
And it's thought that this type of fat is pretty abundantly present in people and important for regulating insulin sensitivity widely. So, diabetes drugs like thiazolidinediones tend to activate beige fat very strongly, and that's important for producing metabolic benefits in people. Brown fat is a more hotly debated topic. There's really no doubt that brown adipose tissue is present in rodents, and because it's vitally important for regulating rodent body temperature. However, in humans, there is evidence that it's present. However, its function is pretty well debated in the field. There's pretty great evidence in a lot of good journals that the amount of human brown fat declines with age. However, it's not quite clear that the thermogenic functions of brown adipose tissue in people, that being the generation of heat, is substantive enough to burn calories and cause weight loss. And this is a fairly new concept because it was thought that brown adipose tissue in humans was lost after is present in babies, right? It's present back of babies and part of the mechanism to keep babies warm, but that it was steadily lost as you grow up. And then there was a really pioneering story from a couple of groups that identified FDG PET positive brown fat in the shoulder intraclavicular regions of humans. And this was really an exciting time because if you could turn on those adipose tissue depots and cause them to burn calories selectively, that would be wonderful for causing weight loss. And it turns out that there hasn't been a lot of success in developing therapies or interventions that activate human brown fat enough to burn calories and cause weight loss. But there are a number of interesting studies that have suggested that brown fat in people and in rodents can have endocrine effects that are important for systemic physiology.
I see. So if I'm hearing you correctly so far on the brown fat exists. It probably exists in most or all mammals. It definitely exists and definitely causes thermogenesis in rodents.
Mhm.
And it is probably less prominent and less physiologically potent, at least in that respect, in humans. It's not clear whether or not the brown fat is doing the same thing in humans as it does in rodents. Maybe it's doing other things it doesn't do in rodents. Maybe it's sort of like a bit of an evolutionary remnant. Is that sort of maybe a possibility here?
I mean, I guess that's possible that it's an evolutionary remnant.
But it's still quite mysterious in terms of human function.
Yes, in adult humans.
Mm. Okay, so in babies, though, it is sort of a bona fide thermogenic tissue.
Yes, yes, yes. And the Holy Grail would be, especially shortly after this depot was rediscovered in adults, would be if you could activate brown fat selectively, turn on the thermogenic function in some way that was positive, you could burn calories, right?
Mm-hmm.
Rather than burn calories through the activation of mitochondria in brown fat.
So when you say burn calories, it sounds like activating brown adipose tissue would likely result, based on our knowledge, in the burning of fat elsewhere in the body. And if that's the case, I'm wondering how that happens, how that communication across tissues would happen.
So, sorry, say that again.
So the brown adipose tissue thermogenesis phenomenon in rodents or in other species, say, when that happens, it is are you simply burning away the brown adipose tissue, or do you burn away fat elsewhere in the body?
Oh, so brown adipose tissue is a really great place for burning carbohydrates and lipids.
Mm.
And so it's a sink for consuming these things. And instead of generating ATP, what brown fat does is it generates chemical energy as heat. And it performs this function by dissipating the chemical energy gradient in the mitochondria and affecting hydrogen um, uh, ion exchange across the mitochondrial gradient. It also is important for burning some amino acids as well. So it can perform sink-like functions for burning both sugars and fat. And it does. It's not that it gets bigger per se or gets smaller. It uh, performs this function and sort of sustains its volume.
Hmm.
There are no known ways that I'm aware of in people that can make more brown fat.
I see. So it's a pretty stable organ in a sense.
Yes, it yes, but for reasons that are not totally clear, in aging, the presence of FDG positive brown fat begins to decline.
Hmm. And what, like in a normal, like healthy person, what percentage of the fat would be brown versus white, say?
So I don't know off the top of my head. I mean, we're talking about perhaps magnitude differences.
Hmm. So yeah,
In,
I would guess that we have much more white
yeah,
adipose tissue.
yes, I mean, I hesitate to say what the actual number is. I don't know off the top of my head. That being said, not knowing that number means the amount of white fat is far, far greater than the
Hmm.
amount of brown fat in people. Rodents have quite a large um, amount of brown fat that's located in their intrascapular um, space.
Hmm. Presumably that's because they're so small, they're much more prone to hypothermia.
Their size definitely is part of the reason they need brown fat to burn energy.
Hmm. So when we think about fat and energy storage and the endocrine functions of fat cells and you know what they do beyond just being a storage receptacle for energy for us to burn later, um what like can you describe for people a little bit, maybe paint us a picture at the cellular level, of how fat is stored, and we'll start there. Is you know is the whole is a fat cell literally just ballooning up with fatty acid molecules? What does the storage look like on a cellular level?
So the fat cell is uh, a cell that's uniquely responsive to anabolic hormones like insulin.
Mm.
And when glucose levels um, get high after a meal and achieve first pass circulation through the intestine and out past the liver, insulin acts on adipose tissue to clear glucose from circulation. And adipose tissue is really specialized to take that glucose and perform glycolysis in the TCA cycle to generate the intermediates for performing lipogenesis, which is the process for creating the substrate to make a lipid droplet. And that process of lipogenesis is reflected by that the the sort of empty, clear material that you see on things like histology. Um, and adipose tissue has this really unique, specialized function for making glucose into lipid in that way. Not all tissues in the body are made up to perform this function. And in fact, skeletal muscle and adipose tissue are really the only places that are responsive to insulin in a way that clears glucose from circulation.
And what
And
makes
there are really no other tissues besides adipose tissue that can perform lipogenesis in ways that are non-toxic for the cell.
hmm,
Most other cell types don't perform lipogenesis in great degrees because it requires a lot of ATP.
mhm. And sort of so this process of lipogenesis, what form are the fats in when they're stored in these fat cells? Are they triglycerides? Are they is it just sort of like a bubble of triglycerides? Is it something else?
It's a triglyceride, and when you're fasting and you need energy to be liberated, lipolysis is the process that liberates that fatty acid from triglyceride, and is a process of breaking down that droplet. You liberate uh, free fatty acids and glycerol
Mhm.
from the triglyceride.
And like under normal conditions, when I say normal conditions, I mean a metabolically healthy person with some amount of fat, not too much, not too little. So I would imagine that the fat system, the white adipose tissue system, a big part of its purpose is for fat storage. It's for conserving energy for later, use in an ecological sense, right? Animals constantly, they have to face seasonal changes in food supply. They have to be able to survive for some amount of time without ingesting food, in a time of famine stay. So it makes sense that you have this sort of storage mechanism there. And I wonder how it ties into things like hunger and satiety systems. Is there signaling that comes directly from fat cells that helps tune how hungry or satiated an animal feels based on its energy storage levels?
Yeah, I mean, this is the cool thing about what adipose tissue does is it's the sensor for how much energy the body is has on hand. And one of the major endocrine hormones that's made from adipose tissue to reflect the body's sort of energy state is this hormone called leptin. And leptin um, is a hormone that has was discovered in the early 90s by Jeff Friedman at Rockefeller. And the discovery of leptin really placed adipose tissue on the map as this vital endocrine tissue. For a long time, adipose tissue was just thought to be this sort of inert sink for storing lipid. But the discovery of hormones like leptin from adipose tissue placed it in this completely separate context of function. And leptin is a hormone that's detected by the brain and reflects hunger. So your brain is detecting falling levels of leptin from adipose tissue, reduced levels of leptin from adipose tissue, and that tells you when it's time to eat. Um,
Hmm.
in obesity, um, adipose tissue is making too much leptin, and the brain doesn't sense that hunger signal as well anymore.
Hmm. So are you talking about leptin resistance here?
Yes,
I see. So despite the fact that there's a lot of adipose tissue making a lot of leptin, in theory, the brain would be detecting those very high levels of leptin. But I guess if you have too much for too long, the something breaks and the
yes,
brain can no longer respond to that satiety signal.
yes, yes. The sort of delta that the brain senses does not work anymore.
Mm.
Um, and this concept of leptin resistance was part of the reason why leptin therapies for obesity failed in clinical trials.
I see.
Because,
The idea would be you could just give someone a bunch of leptin and that
right,
should make them satiated and cure the
right,
obesity.
because I mean, the really cool, there was like a lot of really cool biology associated with these studies, um, that I think were like really truly pioneering papers. Um, so there was a genetic mouse strain that was it's called the OBOB strain. And the OBOB mice have a congenital leptin knockout.
Mm.
And this gene was mapped to leptin. And Jeff Friedman's lab showed that, adding back leptin to these mice could cause them to lose weight.
Mm. So
That
they have
was
the leptin receptor, but they had no leptin hormone.
That's right. So
Super obese.
yes, so they never feel they get they're hyperphagic. They
I see.
never
So they're just eating all the time, basically.
Yes. So they just get obese and they'll get polyuria. And there's a number of other um, phenotypes that are associated with OB that are also interesting, like they're subfertile, or maybe they're even infertile, I think in at least in female mice. Um, and so the key thing discovery in that one of the key discoveries in those studies was that giving mice those giving mice leptin back caused them to lose weight. So that was part of the biology that set the stage for um, companies to generate leptin therapies, right? And unfortunately, in people with obesity, they didn't work because you already have enough leptin there systemically that adding a little bit more therapeutically or
Hmm.
pharmacologically was unable to break the leptin resistant state.
Hmm. And I would imagine, obviously these mice were engineered on purpose by human beings in a lab.
No, no, no. These were mice that I believe these mice were bred out over a long period of time. It was
Oh,
a
I see.
it was a mutation that emerged spontaneously at Jackson Labs
Oh, wow.
in like
So
the 30s.
they just noticed that there were these morbidly obese mice, and then they figured out
Yes,
what the mutation was that spontaneously arose.
yes. Because in those days this was before gene sequencing, right?
Mm.
People were actually discovering genes, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And so it was a really fundamental discovery. I mean, that being said, I mean, there is a really cool and exciting leaf, this idea, stories that I really love. So there's a story from Sadaf Faruqi, who's a amazing investigator in the United Kingdom, and she identified um, a consanguineous uh, leptin mutation in a Pakistani family, and these children became massively obese. We're talking about a very rare syndrome. I mean,
Hmm.
maybe less than 30 in the world. Um, and these children, um, because of the leptin deficiency, had hyperphagia and gained weight. However, these children responded wonderfully to recombinant leptin therapies.
I see.
They're
And
totally
presumably it was a similar genetic mutation to the mice.
I don't know if it's a I don't know what the sequence similarity between the mutations, but the outcome is the same,
Leptin deficiency.
right? And so those children leptin pharmacologically
Sure.
normalized body weight,
Hmm.
and those are that was the leaf for all of the sort of shortfalls of the leptin therapies in wild type, walking around obese people.
Yeah, and I would imagine, but when some of these things were discovered, it was sufficiently long ago that obesity was sufficiently rare that maybe people were thinking, oh, this is the genetic basis of obesity, and we're going to cure it this way.
Right.
Of course, you fast forward a few decades, and huge proportions of the population have become obese, which basically implies it can't be a rare mutation like that.
Yes, but there are some mutations that are out there that appear to be associated, about
Mhm.
call in people. I think that's still up for debate. Um, but there are not there are rare mutations in some genes that appear to be causal for obesity, but I
Mhm.
think nothing like that's recapitulated in something like an inbred mouse strain.
Mhm. So, this is interesting. This brings us to a broader question that I think you're well suited for. So, on the one hand, there are clear genetic mutations that can be linked to obesity, like the leptin deficiency phenotype. Of course, these are very rare. And despite those, obesity prevalence has ballooned so quickly over such a wide swath of the human population that, it can't be explained away by, a single gene like that. Um, and, in the realm of, outside the scientific realm, there's a lot of people of variable and arguably dubious expertise who will argue about the extent to which obesity is genetic. How would you start to actually think about that question and explain it to a layperson, the extent to which obesity is genetic versus environmental?
Well, obesity is the classic gene times environment problem.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to be really precise in language when I talk about this because I don't want to be misinformed the population. Um, I don't I don't think it's very clear why obesity rates have skyrocketed in the past 30 years. There are many reasons why people think this has happened. Number one is calorie dense foods being readily available to us, everywhere, right? This is not just readily available high calorie dense foods, but also things like high fructose corn syrup, which has changed, the sweetener, which has changed sugar sweetening of of beverages and drinks. So that's one thing that people really point to as a primary causal um, uh, as causation for more obesity in the population. The other one is people exercise less. People are not as active anymore. I don't know
Is
if
that
that's.
is that true?
I mean, I think that there's populations in the country which don't who may not be as active.
Mm-hmm. My
Um,
yeah, my interpretation of the data, depending on where you look, some
yeah,
people say, it's been flat. It's actually increased somewhat, and there's some indirect measures of that. Um, I would say yes, no, maybe so. My interpretation of the data is there's probably been maybe a bifurcation of the population where one subset is exercising more and perhaps some other subset is exercising less. And the net effect, balances out, but it's probably not a uniform effect across the population.
I agree. I agree. And then I think um, so the food and environment, the food and environmental influences are certainly, I think, the best causal reason for why people are more obese now than they were 40 years ago. Um, I also think that there's perhaps maybe genetic contributions that are present um, that have yet to be defined. I mean, there are ongoing efforts, I think, to do large scale sequencing to find causal variants. I mentioned Sadaf Faruqi. She's really one of the leaders in this field of identifying variants that are predictive of not just predictive and causal of obesity, not just body weight, but also behaviors associated with obesity. Um, but I don't think it's really, totally clear why there are more people who are obese now than there was. I mean, people are always pointing towards, highly available calorie dense foods, and that's certainly explanatory. But this is an ongoing um, question that's out there. I mean, things like people think that more pollution in the in the environment is also a contributing factor.
Mm-hmm.
Chemicals that are in bottles and stuff
Mhm.
like.
Well, I want to come back to something you mentioned earlier. You said something like, fat cells are sort of uniquely responsive to anabolic signals like insulin. Obviously, there's an insulin receptor that cells can express to detect and respond to insulin. When we think so, a question that I have about insulin resistance, a genuine question that I don't understand yet, is I'll let you explain for everyone what insulin resistance actually is, especially with respect to an adipose tissue and what that means. But when we say that cells have become insulin resistant, the name of the phenomenon
Mhm.
suggests that the cell is no longer responding to insulin. Is that the case, or is the response different than it used to be? Like, what exactly is insulin resistance in terms of the response to insulin at the cellular level?
So, I mean, insulin resistance as a feature really means that a cell requires more of that signal to initiate the pathways that are downstream of the receptor to perform processes like lipogenesis
Okay.
and glucose uptake. And, you know, that's a shared feature of other resistance syndromes, right? So leptin resistance, for example, is a similar type of idea. You need more leptin present to activate um, the leptin receptor in POMC neurons
Mm-hmm.
or in the hypothalamus. It's the same concept in the skeletal muscle and the adipose tissue.
Mm-hmm.
Your
And
cells
do we
become
do
your
we know
cells.
do we know where the resistance comes from in the sense of so for insulin resistance, say, is it can can it be explained by cells expressing less insulin receptor than they should, or that something inside the cell is broken so that you need more receptor activation? Do we understand it at that level?
One of the you know, possible explanations for this, which is also very hotly debated, is that adipose tissue is not just adipocytes. In obesity, you have greater numbers of immune cells that get into adipose tissue.
Mm,
Those immune cells produce cytokines that can interrupt the 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 sensitivity of things like the insulin receptor to insulin, right? So like classic cytokines that are macrophage derived, like TNF alpha and interferon gamma, in low levels, chronically secreted in adipose tissue, can alter um, insulin regulation of its receptor and the signaling and kinase cascades that are downstream. And that's one of the thoughts behind how sort of insulin signaling gets disrupted in adipose tissue and obesities, because you get infiltration of cells that are not adipocytes. They produce low levels of immune cytokines that have chronic and prolonged effects on the signaling networks that are important for internalizing glucose into the cell.
hmm,
And that can have, varying effects on like insulin receptor expression, right?
mhm.
Um, but at a base level, those cytokines interfere with the sensitivity of those signaling networks to the hormones.
Got it. So fundamentally, so if we're talking about adipose tissue, insulin resistance means, at baseline, at a certain level of insulin, you had a certain amount of lipogenesis, a certain amount of glucose uptake. And at time point two, after some resistance has developed, you now need some more insulin than you needed before to get the same amount of all that stuff happening.
That's right. That's exactly right.
And are fat cells, are they more prone to insulin resistance, less prone to insulin resistance than other cells? Are they average? Is there something special about them in terms of developing insulin resistance?
That's a really good question. I would say they are more prone to insulin resistance because they are highly insulin sensitive in the process that they perform. They're vital for performing glucose uptake. The skeletal muscle is another place where insulin resistance gets manifested because those are the tissues that are important for performing glucose internalization into cells. The liver is also a place where insulin resistance can develop, because in people with obesity and diabetes, they also develop an inability to turn off hepatic glucose production from the liver, and insulin is really important for that um, physiologic process as well.
Hmm. When Well, I want to talk about the development of both obesity and insulin resistance. I'll let you kind of take it where you want, but the question I have to anchor us here is obviously calories are an important factor here. The amount of calories that you're consuming is an important factor, but another factor that people like to talk about and point to is that, well, it's not just about calories per se, it's about the particular type of calories one is consuming, and that's going to be an important factor in terms of your propensity to develop insulin resistance and obesity. Can you talk a little bit about macronutrients, especially dietary fats and dietary carbohydrates, and whether one of them is a bigger driver in insulin resistance and fat cells, if one of them is a bigger driver in obesity, and maybe how you start to think about those things?
Um, so I think that nutrition is a field where there's a lot of just bad information.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think it's certainly true that fructose, for example, is a sugar that is associated with insulin resistance.
Hmm.
That effect is primarily from the liver.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of what the adipose tissue sees, um, it's not a great fructose disposal location. Um, and you can have um, you know, lipids like palmitate floating around that are certainly bad for uh, the metabolic functions of adipocytes. But we really, in my group, we tend to not think too much about macronutrients and other sort of nutritional species and how they influence adipose tissue functions. Um, Partly because there's no win. There's not really a winning path there, right? Because I think there's a lot of information that may or may not be true and can never be true, can never be proven. I mean, so my lab, we tend to kind of stay away from those areas for those reasons,
Mm-hmm.
um, because we're really fundamentally interested in what are the precise types of pathways that are operant in the fat cell that are important for performing lipogenesis and regulating obesity phenotypes.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't want to dodge the question, but we stay away from that because I just think, in my opinion, only that that particular field in nutrition and macronutrient compositions, um, there's just a lot of debate, and
Mm-hmm.
I don't think there's great resolution on what's true and not true. So
And so just getting back to some of the basic physiology of adipose tissue, white adipose tissue in particular. I don't know, can you give us a sense for, so let's say you're a normal metabolically healthy person, and let's compare that to someone with obesity or metabolic syndrome, where the fat cells are now misbehaving in some way. Um, is what starts to break in the fat cells that would say, I don't know, cause them to accumulate too much fat too quickly or something like this, or conversely, not be able to get rid of that fat or utilize it for energy purposes? In what ways do the adipose tissue cells actually start to lose their original function in a metabolically unhealthy state?
so this is a part of uh, the response to the microenvironment is one important way that adipose tissue loses its ability to perform its metabolic and endocrine functions. So in adipose tissue, um, during the early parts of obesity, the adipocyte in that tissue requires expansion of the endothelial cell network. And this is important for providing nutrients and regulating the oxygen content in the tissue so that adipose tissue has the signals that cause expansion. Okay. And at some point, that chronic stress of obesity begins to outstrip a lot of the endothelial cell network. And so things like hypoxia start to set in,
Mm.
other strong inflammatory responses from
So
macrophage.
do you mean literally like the endothelial tissue can't expand enough to accommodate the mass that's
Yes,
forming, and like now oxygen can't quite diffuse into all the little crevices and things like that?
yes, that's
Okay,
precisely correct.
I see.
So you're stripping the tissue of critical nutrients.
I see.
And
Because it's everything's packed in too tight, basically.
that's right. And that appears to be really what the tipping, part of the tipping point that occurs in adipose tissue is that the endothelial network just gets outstripped
Hmm.
by calorie demand. And that's associated with accumulation of things like macrophages and T cells. And that event where you get accumulation of non-adipocyte cells in the tissue appears to interfere with the ability of the adipocyte to store more energy properly. And there have been a lot of cool studies in mice and some correlative prospective analyses in people where if they perform genetic manipulations of you know endothelial cell interacting molecules, you can make huge adipose tissues and you can cause mice to get like 100 grams, right?
And a
And
normal
they
mouse would be what, 20 grams maybe?
so if you put a mouse on a high put a standard black six strain mouse on a high fat diet for let's say 12 weeks, a high fat diet being 60% of its diet coming from fat, that mouse will weigh between 40 and 50 grams.
And that's a
30,
big that's a big mouse.
right? These mice that are genetically engineered to expand adipose tissue mass and maintain all of the endothelial structures appropriately, they can be up to 100 grams. And they look like hockey pucks, right? And histologically, they have these really small subcutaneous fat cells.
I see. So you've sort of maximized the amount of subcutaneous fat storage they're capable of packing on.
I mean, I don't know, maximizing. I mean, you just really make them like super capable of making and storing fat very well.
Hmm.
And so I really love genetic studies like that because it really strongly implicates that if you can maintain this like healthy microenvironment of adipose tissue, you can make it expand in ways that don't really make the animal diabetic.
Hmm. I see. So these animals get ultra fat, but it's subcutaneous fat. The endothelial tissue is expanding to accommodate that fat, and so you're not getting the same levels of insulin resistance and inflammation and things like that.
That's right.
Hmm.
That's right. And so that really implicates these like interacting cells in the microenvironment is really important for talking to the adipocyte in ways that allows the adipocyte to get the adipose tissue to be better at storing energy.
Hmm.
That doesn't mean that it's still not bad to be overweight. It's still bad to be overweight. It's not good for your skeleton, for example.
Hmm.
But it does say that making adipose tissue healthy can protect the organism from
Yeah.
from
And I mean, and like you said, it does show us that it really has something to do with how the tissue is expanding and being packed together. And even though human beings don't put on weight like the hockey puck mouse model, the fact that we don't put on weight that way tells us, that tells us what part of the problem is.
Right.
So I have a question. So when people become obese and these things start to happen, the fat cells, everything's just getting packed in too much. You start to get some hypoxia. The cells can't properly be, given nutrition and things like this, just because of that density, because everything's packed in like that. A lot of that's going to have to do with, I think, the visceral fat that we know people put on, that we were talking about before. I guess one little question I have here is maybe, when we think about things like inflammation, chronic inflammation, and all of these extra non-adipose cells coming into the mix and making making things packed in so tight, to what extent are those immune cells, that inflammation, to what extent is that sort of a cause versus a consequence here? Is there something, is something breaking that's then creating a signal that the immune system is listening to, where the immune system is trying to come in and fix it? Or is the immune system somehow getting in there for whatever reason, and then that's sort of a upstream in the process of obesity?
That's a super spot on question, right? And it's something that we're in the field, we're thinking a lot about. And there were a lot of really pioneering and nice stories in the 20 years ago or so, which found higher levels of inflammatory cytokines in mouse models and in people. It was thought that these were accumulation of these cytokines like TNF and interferons and stuff like that, that those are really causal for diabetes. Accumulation of those cytokines in adipose tissue,
Mm-hmm.
really causal for diabetes. And so there were a lot of clinical trials for drugs that temper TNF alpha, for example. Um, those those trials really showed no benefit
Hmm.
or insulin resistance, no obesity, no reduction in body weight, despite all of the stuff that had been shown in rodents, which was like everywhere. And so it's also true that anti-diabetic therapies like metformin and thiazolidinediones and GLP-1 receptor agonists, the effect associated with those drugs coincides with reduction of inflammation in adipose tissue.
Hmm.
Um, However, the idea that these drugs, anti-inflammatory drugs, exert really no benefit on body weight or glucose metabolism in people would really suggest that inflammation and inflammatory cell responses in adipose tissue is really like a response, a reparative response in some way that we don't fully understand well. That you need sort of macrophages to get in there and help remodel the adipose tissue in ways that are beneficial for making the tissue size larger, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that's what we think too in our group. We think that those responses at the level of inflammation are important for like reparative responses
Mm-hmm.
that help
But
make the tissue perform better.
supposing that's true, they're going in there to repair something. They might get, for whatever reason, caught up and then become part of the problem as kind of a side effect of trying to come in and fix something.
Right.
But again, supposing that's true, my guess is we don't yet know what that signal, what they're detecting, and what maybe they're going in to try and fix.
I don't think we know what that signal is very well.
Mm-hmm.
At least precisely. We don't know what it is precisely. And this is not to diminish the idea that um, whole body inflammation in obesity and diabetes isn't bad. I think there's certainly room to implicate inflammation as being bad. I just don't know that we know the mechanism as to why it's bad or why it's not bad.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a question of intense debate. Um, that I think we'd all like to know the answer to. Like,
Hmm.
is inflammation in adipose tissue bad or good, or is it just a biomarker?
Hmm.
Um, and so for my group, we think it's more just a biomarker of adipose tissue dysfunction.
Hmm. Are fat cells, given their energy storage functions, given what they do they harbor sort of bigger or more mitochondria? Are they producing more reactive oxygen species? Are they somehow more prone to oxidative stress or anything like that?
So uh, there's certainly a lot of evidence to suggest that bigger fat cells in obesity have compromised mitochondrial function.
Hmm.
Uh, White fat cells that you would see in the visceral space, even in the subcutaneous adipose tissue depots, they have far less mitochondria than a beige adipocyte, far less mitochondria than a brown fat cell.
Hmm.
And the mitochondrial function is actually like is really important for performing the metabolic reactions in the cell that allow lipogenesis to be performed appropriately. Um, so uh, as far as like reactive oxygen species and oxidative stress, those terms I think have become more confusing over the years. Because at some level you need reactive oxygen species to be generated in quantities that serve signaling purposes in the cell.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, like for mitochondria to function normally, you generate reactive oxygen species as a byproduct.
Yeah. So what you're saying basically is reactive oxygen species aren't all bad all the time. Cells are in some sense generating them on purpose, and it's actually serving a useful signal and function.
Yes. 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 So knowing where that, again, that tipping point would be to make them really, pathological is something different altogether.
Mm-hmm.
But I want to say that not all ROS and oxidative signals in the fat cell are all bad.
Mm-hmm.
I think that there's like location that matters, the concentration that matters, the density of those stresses inside the cell, compartmentalization of those signals that may cause them to be bad or good. And I think that those types of terms get um, sort of thrown around a lot as being causal, but that there's no doubt that reactive oxygen species from the mitochondria occurs right in the cell as part of its normal operation of the electron transport chain. And it's certainly also true that alterations in the generation of ROS could be bad for the cell. That could mean like less reactive oxygen species generated. That could also be bad. Right. In the liver, it appears that in obesity and diabetes, you have a slowing of the electron transport chain in the liver, and that's essentially associated with um, like worsening tempering of the ROS that's generated from that
Hmm.
from those activities.
Yeah, if reactive oxygen species are generated as a natural consequence of various physiological activities in cells, and that is used as a signal for normal, healthy cell functioning, you could imagine things going in either direction. Too much or too little reactive oxygen species could be problematic.
Right, right. But this idea that there's like broad-based, negative consequences of reactive oxygen species, I think is just not correct.
Hmm.
Um, and I think that's pretty well agreed
Mm-hmm.
upon people in our field.
Mm-hmm. I want to ask you about the liver a little bit and fatty liver disease. So, obviously, white adipose tissue. When we think about energy storage, that's tissue where fat is supposed to accumulate. The impression one gets is that fatty liver disease represents an accumulation of fat in the liver, and you're not really supposed to accumulate much fat in the liver. Can you just give us let's just start very basic with what is fatty liver disease and to what extent is the liver supposed to be accumulating any fat?
So the in the liver is we do have a little bit of work in the liver, but it's not my major space of expertise. So I'll tell you what I know. Um, and so the liver is maybe one of the most is maybe the most important metabolic organ in mammals,
Mm-hmm.
because it senses all of these different nutritional signals to to make sure your body is sourced with things like glucose, for example, right? And in the liver, uh, insulin is sensed to suppress hepatic glucose production in the fasted state. So if you're fasting, the liver is starting to turn stored glycogen into glucose for the organism.
Mm-hmm.
If you eat a meal, insulin is ultimately released from the beta cell to produce responses that are associated with um, glucose uptake in the adipose tissue and the skeletal muscle, but also to suppress hepatic glucose production from the liver. Okay. Um, and part of that response of insulin in the liver is to promote lipogenesis.
Hmm.
That's like the canonical function of insulin, whether it's occurring in the adipose tissue or it's in the liver. And an inability of that insulin anabolic signal to be turned off in the liver is really what's associated with the accumulation of fat in the liver. And this really reflects an aberrant, overall whole body response to the signals that are required to maintain glucose homeostasis.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and fatty liver disease, it's actually called um, metabolic, uh, metabolically associated steatotic liver disease or something like that. I'm sorry. It has a much longer name now. They've renamed it, and the acronym is called MASLD, uh, because they of the sensitivity for uh, people who are for sensitivity purposes they renamed it.
I see. It's probably because historically we used to pretty much associate fatty liver with alcoholism, but now we see
Correct.
it in many, many more
I
conditions.
mean, calling it non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is partly a misnomer.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so yeah, fatty liver disease is really is downstream of aberrant responses to insulin
Hmm.
and an inability to turn off lipogenesis in the insulin resistant state.
I see. So basically, problems with insulin sensitivity can cause the liver to the lipogenesis mechanisms to get sort of stuck on.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. But you also in tandem have glucagon levels not being regulated properly, which is also keeping that hepatic glucose production level higher.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so you have this really like constellation of hormone changes which keep lipogenesis high, but also don't turn off hepatic glucose production properly.
I see. So simultaneously, you've got too much fat, which is we think of as energy storage, and you have high levels of glucose. Under normal conditions, you would think, okay, we're going to take down these glucose levels and then store them as fat. So there'd be more of a as one goes down, the other one goes up. But here they're sort of both up.
Yep. Yep. Like all the anabolic signals are just critically on.
Mm-hmm. So going back to this idea that it's too much fat can be bad, but also too little fat. When we think about so you mentioned these rare genetic disorders earlier, where people don't have body fat that causes them to become very insulin resistant, things like this. What are some of the problems? So in people who don't have those rare genetic conditions, what would be some issues that can start to arise if your body fat gets too low? And how low is too low? And, I understand here there's probably going to be important differences between males and females. And
Mm.
I'll kind of let you take it where you want. There's probably a number of places we could go with this, but what are some of the consequences of burning too much of your body fat off?
Well, um, so in conditions like cancer cachexia, right, where your tumors are causing hyperlipolytic syndromes, um, you can have uh, wasting,
Mm-hmm.
body wasting that can occur. That's one condition. Um, in um, people who are like very lean, you also have aberrant insulin responses. You have hyperinsulinemia in many conditions, and you have no place to put excess sugar. I mean,
Mm.
weirdly, a lot of these things are not associated with appetite. People who are lean have I don't think they have a reported lesser appetite. Um, but the other thing that tends to happen is in women, uh, fertility is a little bit lower, is lower
Mm-hmm.
in women who are very lean, but also women who are very obese also have clinical subfertility.
Hmm.
And that's really, I think, and we're trying to work on this question in our lab too. And I think this is really placed in this concept that um, fertility, an appropriate amount of adipose tissue is really important for reproduction.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't have enough adipose tissue, then you won't reproduce.
Mm-hmm. Makes
Right?
sense.
Yeah. I mean, you're not your body is not going to repurpose the energy for reproduction when it's about surviving.
Mm-hmm.
And so those are the consequences of being sort of having lower body weight, that we're aware of, um, and questions that we're sort of trying to understand in our lab, because we're working on projects where we're using animal models that don't develop adipose tissue or lose adipose tissue spontaneously. And those animal models have lower reproductive fecundity,
Mm-hmm.
lower ovulation responses to
Mm-hmm.
become their estrous cycles become irregular.
Mm-hmm. And do we know how some of that crosstalk happens between things like adipose tissue and the reproductive system? Are there factors that are secreted that are tuning fertility to fat levels and things like that?
Yes, there are well-known influences of leptin on the let's see, the hypothalamic pituit HPO axis.
Hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis.
Yeah, ovary axis.
Oh,
HP
ovary axis. Okay.
HPO.
HPO.
Which my one of my students is on vacation on her honeymoon right now, and like this is her project. I was like, I wish she was here to whisper the acronym in my ear again. But it's the HPO axis, and this is pretty well established about how leptin regulates fertility in animal models and in people. Um, and again, it's like based in some of those models of the leptin deficient backgrounds. The OBOB female mice, the leptin deficient mice, they're infertile, but their fertility can be rescued by doing intracerebral injections of leptin into the brain.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And so there's been pretty well, established influences of leptin on reproduction.
Hmm. So too much or too little leptin is associated with lower fertility rates.
Yes.
Hmm.
Yes. Because those are reflections of, I mean, of obesity.
hmm Yeah, so I suppose like obviously if you're too lean, you don't have the capacity to nourish an additional body. So it makes sense why there would be mechanisms in place to reduce fertility. And I suppose on the opposite extreme, an obese animal, an obese female, you might think, well, in some sense, maybe it's surprising that fertility drops because you've got more than enough energy to go around. But if there's like a leptin resistance thing, if leptin signal's not getting into the brain to do what it normally does because there's some level of resistance, then signals aren't ultimately getting where they need to go.
Right. That's exactly true.
Interesting. So, what are some of the things that you guys are working on today? Some of the questions that you're thinking about and that you are designing experiments for with regard to just adipose tissue and metabolism, generally speaking.
So in my lab, as I said um, early in our discussion, my lab, it's been basically built from scratch. And I went from, a lab of one, being me, and to a lab of eight. And so during that time, the lab is sort of spread out into a lot of areas. We still have projects where we're interested in fundamentals of adipose tissue biology. What makes an animal? What are the genetic contributions to making an animal obese or lean? What's protective against the effects of high fat diet feeding? So those projects are still ongoing, but I have to admit, because, and I want to say this the right way, because of I think the the revolution in GLP-1 receptor agonists,
Mm,
um, our lab, we've been thinking a little bit more about some other areas to get into. So we've been developing projects in intestinal biology,
mhm.
understand, whether there are shared features between the cell biology of adipose tissue and what happens in the intestine. Because I have to admit, as someone who's worked on mechanisms that are ongoing in obesity, the GLP-1 receptor agonists have like revolutionized the field. And for people like me who have been saying in grants and papers like this molecule that we're working on is the new target for anti-diabetes drugs, that kind of argument is out the window now.
Because now we've got the GLP-1 drugs.
Right? You have an injectable treatment that can manifest 20% weight loss, which I thought I would never see in my lifetime. I never thought that in my career that we would see a drug that's capable of these effects in people.
Hmm.
And so with all of those new, amazing advancements in diabetes and obesity treatment, we've been thinking about these other areas like intestine biology. We have another project that we're working on that's dedicated to understanding the communication between adipose tissue and the liver in people living with HIV infection. Um, and then we've also begun projects where we're thinking about um, these adipose tissue requirements that are that are that are regulating reproduction in 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 women.
Mhm,
Uh, and so those are the basic areas that we've spread into over the past like 4 or 5 years.
mhm,
And we're also obviously really interested in, I'm excited about these new project areas where we're trying to understand how adipose tissue is regulating, novel physiologies. And one of the physiologies we're really trying to pick apart is whether there are endocrine factors from adipose tissue that are regulating body temperature in interesting and new ways. And so those are the types of projects that we've had, we're getting going at the moment, um, because we want to try to sustain research projects in the wave of the new GLP-1 receptor agonists. And I have to say also, that doesn't mean that there won't be projects in obesity. There definitely will be. I mean, there's still a lot of really important research that needs to be pursued to understand why these novel therapies produce such amazing effects. Um, but I made the decision for the future that pursuing these other areas of science would be good for the lab.
Hmm.
Also,
Basically what you're saying is the success, the quick adoption of these GLP-1 drugs, the weight loss that many people who take them are seeing, it led you to make strategic decisions in your lab to
yeah,
pursue certain things and not pursue other lines of research to do with obesity because of the effect these drugs are having.
right. And I'll also say that um, you know I'm I'm lucky to have a group where I can have people to work with that I get along with that care a lot about, and this is their interests, right? So I have people that join the lab and they're saying, "Hey, I'm kind of interested in this intestinal biology project, or I'm interested in this question in the intestine," and we come up with a crazy idea to go after. So some of it's based in making strategic decisions about where to go in science, but also I think at the same time making sure that we have project areas that are completely aligned with what people want to work on. Um, because ultimately, I'm wholly dedicated to helping people, pursue novel ideas and build out their careers in productive ways.
Mhm. Can I ask you a little bit about the GLP-1 drugs?
Yeah, of course. Well, I can
Um,
tell you what I know.
yeah. So my understanding is some pretty substantial proportion of people will see body weight reductions if they take these GLP-1 drugs. Um, my understanding is that this thing isn't just causing people to burn fat. My understanding is that they're losing comparable amounts of fat mass and lean mass, which basically means muscle tissue. To what extent is that is true, and to what extent, there's questions here too on sort of the reversibility of some of obesity induced physiological changes. So my understanding is when people come off these drugs, they basically become very hungry again and they put back on the weight, which would imply that sort of nothing, while you are losing mass, you haven't necessarily fixed something to do with, say, a broken satiety mechanism.
Correct. Yes, that's absolutely correct. So, um, the GLP-1 receptor agonists, those are acting in the brain,
Mm-hmm.
and they influence appetite. And it's a really cool, it's a really cool set of physiology, right? So GLP-1 is secreted from the intestine,
Mm-hmm.
okay, the gut. This hormone is embedded in glucagon, okay? And glucagon is a is a is a hormone that's important for raising blood glucose from the
Mm-hmm.
liver. And GLP-1 is this fragment that's derived from the glucagon gene and made from the intestine, acts on the brain to help temper um, appetite. So you're eating less. And that's really the reason why people are losing weight is your desire to eat is considerably suppressed. So it's not really burning fat per se. You're tipping the energy balance scale towards eating less.
I see. So yeah, it's not promoting the burning of fat. It is suppressing appetite.
Yeah. And so regarding the lean mass loss, I think one of the concepts that's missed in some of the popular literature is that when you when you gain fat mass as a result of gaining weight, you also gain lean mass,
Mm,
right? That's part of the process of gaining weight. Um, it's not all mass
mhm.
that's derived from adipose
Yeah.
tissue.
So whether or not you're hitting the bench press or not, when you gain weight, it's always going to be some amount of fat and muscle mass.
Lean mass, yes.
Lean mass. Yeah, sorry.
And so, as a product of losing weight from eating less, you are losing fat mass, which also means you're going to be losing some lean mass too.
Mm-hmm. So to some extent, that's expected.
That's totally expected from animal studies. And I think people working in the field are like well familiar with this effect. And I don't, from my reading of the literature, it doesn't appear that the loss of lean mass is bad for people.
I see. So it doesn't appear to you that the loss of lean mass is out of bounds of what you would expect from just losing some mass.
Right. It's not like a wasting syndrome.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Now, do you want to have therapies that could sustain lean mass? Yes, of course. But it doesn't appear to be like a negative, doesn't appear to be a negative side effect of GLP-1 receptor agonists.
Hmm.
It's just a consequence of losing weight.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that being said, there's also a lot of attention in the field for things like nausea and other sort of downsides of taking these drugs. But those also appear to be pretty well tolerated because people want to lose weight,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right?
And many people can. I don't think it works for everyone, but some good fraction of people can, as long as they stay on the drug.
That's
Now,
right.
when they come off of it, my understanding is their appetite comes back sometimes with quite a resurgence. They basically gain the weight back right away.
Yep.
What is that telling us or not telling us about, what is actually being fixed here in terms of, that basic observation basically implies that there has been nothing fixed in terms of like the natural ability of the body to regulate hunger and satiety to a healthy degree.
Right. So you have to employ um, behavior, uh, implement behavior changes at the same time as having beneficial effects of a therapy.
Mm-hmm.
Right. But I think one of the physiologic outcomes that becomes very clear in my opinion, from when people stop taking the drug is it really implicates the fact that obesity is a is a is a disorder of the brain, and it's not some behavioral choice in people. If people don't, people don't by nature choose to become obese or overweight, which I think is a common misconception in society, right? That people who are obese can choose to eat less or they're choosing to eat more. And that's definitely not the case. And I think that is partly proven by what happens when you stop taking GLP-1 receptor agonists. The brain again comes back on with the raging appetite to reactivate those mechanisms for eating more. And so those are really like the prime evidence that obesity is not just a disease, is a disease of sort of physiology, not just behavior. Um, Behavior changes.
I think I understand what you're saying on one level, but I don't understand it on another level. Like I ultimately don't understand the difference between, say, physiology and behavior. Because at the end of the day, that's where all of our behavior comes from.
Right. So what I'm saying is behavior in terms of making a choice, right? Making a choice to exercise or making a choice to eat less, right? And I think there's a position out there that would say that people with obesity choose to exercise less, or they're choosing to eat more, or they're adopting behaviors that are not beneficial.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that and people in the field think that it's not really those choices that make obesity um, manifest itself. There are effects occurring in the brain
Hmm.
that sort of disallow those positive behavior
Hmm.
choices.
Um, I understand the argument. I'm not sure I agree because by analogy, let's just take an easy example: smoking. Say,
Yeah.
well, actually, people don't choose to be addicted. There's a mesolimbic dopamine reward system. It controls our behavior. And once you take enough nicotine, you get enough LTP in the nucleus accumbens, and people can't choose to stop. So therefore, nicotine addiction has nothing to do with the choices people make.
Yes. And I think there's
That's a very that's a perfectly valid argument to make.
yeah, I know I'm talking to a neuroscientist. So I forgot about that for a second. That I might be getting into some dangerous waters, but there is, I think, pretty good evidence too that the centers that are important for regulating satiety in the brain are very closely tied into reward centers.
Hmm.
And those would suggest that people who have, or who have overeating, those are clicking on reward centers that don't get turned off very well anymore.
Hmm.
And um, part of what people are seeing with GLP-1 receptor agonists is like a reduced desire to drink.
Yes.
And perhaps that's tied into, this tempering of reward centers in ways that are beneficial.
Yes. Um, the potential benefit there is that you've got a knock-on benefit of basically you're reducing things like alcoholism in addition to helping people lose weight. The potential downside there is that this is another rimonabant situation where rimonabant was a weight loss drug back in the 2000s, approved in Europe, CB1 receptor antagonist, eventually recalled because by tapping into the reward system, that all of these things, everything, there's ultimately kind of one reward system that food rewards, drug rewards, sex rewards, they all tie into the same system. But when you dampen down that system, you dampen down everything. And in the case of rimonabant, that included the will to live because they started getting people with suicidal ideations and depression.
Right,
So there's potential upside here and potential downside.
right. Yeah. But I think like going back to the original concept, I do think that because we're stopping GLP-1 receptors causes reestablishes weight gain again, it does, I think really firmly implicate, that um, these parts of the brain can only be temporarily, suppressed, and that they're still like can be clicked on very easily.
Mm-hmm. Um, we've
But
already covered.
the other
Oh,
thing
sorry.
that appears to be true, just I think if I recall the original question is there are some people who don't respond
Mm,
to the weight loss aspect of GLP-1 receptor
yeah.
agonist.
Do you remember how like what percentage it is?
I think it's close to about 5%.
5%.
Yes.
Okay, so a sizable minority seem to not
Right.
respond.
I mean, the amazing thing about those clinical trials that were performed was for weight loss was the level of meeting the primary outcome, like of weight loss, right? It was like almost 100% of the people meeting that primary outcome, which doesn't happen that often in clinical trials.
Hmm.
Even the people that um, don't lose weight still um, receive the anti-diabetic benefits.
Mm.
So there's perhaps some effects of GLP-1 receptor agonists that are uncoupled from weight loss.
Hmm.
And that's where I think there could be a lot really exciting discovery, right? because in that fraction of people, maybe there are genetic variants
Mm,
that would be predictive of lesser effects of GLP-1 receptor agonists or something along those lines.
hmm. Interesting. Do you think, I mean, I guess the only thing preventing more widespread adoption of these drugs is the cost right now,
Correct.
probably.
Yep.
Do you,
Yep.
I don't know if this is your area. I don't know much about the laws and why they are the way they are. Do you know why it's not covered by healthcare right now?
I don't know why it's not covered by insurers.
Mhm.
My
Um,
personal feeling is that for it to be more widely, well, let me back up again. So I think that it's covered by some insurers, but not
if it,
all.
I think, yeah, I think if you're getting it for like diabetes reasons,
Right.
yes. But if you merely want it for weight loss, I don't think it is.
Yes, I believe that's true. Um, and that may change based on some of the newer clinical trials that have come out, which have seen benefits, cardiometabolic benefits in people with obesity, but not diabetes.
Hmm. I guess right now the insurers can probably argue that if you merely want it for weight loss and there's nothing else you can point to in terms of health effects, that this is, it's a cosmetic thing in their eyes, and that's why they're not paying for it.
Correct. And I do think that there is, my opinion is that there will be an important role of government to keep costs low so that these treatments become more widely available. Um, and they're also fighting upstream with sort of supply chain challenges too.
Hmm.
There's going to be like paradigm shifting availability of the oral versions of these drugs. Um, but my understanding is that to make, one pill of, you tirzepatide means, 100 fewer injections can be made
Mm.
because of the amount of material that goes into making the
Oh,
oral
I see. Yeah,
form.
yeah.
And
So
so
there,
there,
yeah, there's cost issues there.
so there's going to be those types of trade-offs that are also present in thinking about how to make these treatments more widely available, both from I think pharmaceutical industry, but also from physicians that are prescribing drugs and also making it more widely available from health insurance.
Hmm. Well, Dr. Hartig, this has been fascinating. We covered quite a bit today. Is
Yeah.
there anything that you want to reiterate for people, or any final thoughts you want to leave them with to do with any of the topics that we covered about body fat, about metabolism?
I think that the main takeaway is two things I would like to say. Number one, um, obesity is really not a choice. I mean, there are cellular physiologic mechanisms that make a person obese. It's not just a choice to be that way. There are alterations in hormones and other outcomes of cellular dysfunction that are really causal for obesity. There are genetic contributions that are conflated with environmental effects. The second thing I say is sort of um, important in terms of the future of research. And there will be, I think, important reminders for people who are in charge um, that despite the availability of and magic of GLP-1 receptor agonists, that obesity is not going away. And there should really be uh, more interest in thinking about how to support research in this area. And I want to give me 1 second to say a little bit more about this. So obesity is a disease, and I think that you did hit on the statistic at the very beginning of the talk today. It's a condition that's associated with that 40% of people in this country. Okay. Um, the National Institute of Diabetes, Digestive and Kidney Diseases, which is one of the main funding bodies for providing resources to support research like mine, and they are a very, wonderful resource for this. They receive far less funding than something like the National Cancer Institute. And I would say cancer affects far fewer people than obesity. And so I think there really needs to be like a change in the way we think about chronic diseases, because obesity is really a disease that has so many impacts on chronic diseases of aging. It increases the risk of something like 13 cancers. And so if we don't really understand more about why obesity does these things, I'm not sure how we're going to really impact the broader health spectrum in the country and in the world. And I think it's partly because of this disparity in funding for obesity and diabetes versus other diseases, which are awful. I don't want to. Cancer is an awful disease, and there needs to be more funding for that too. But the disparity in funding for obesity versus cancer is great in this country. And I would like to see, hope that there would be more of a light shined on the need to address this, because obesity is not a disease of rich people. I mean, it's a disease of people who, a lot of people who are of lower socioeconomic status. And we sort of ignore those people. And I think that's a major problem in this country. So I hope that we'll do something about that. But we'll see. And I think a lot of it's largely buried in this idea that people who are obese are funny, right? We think of Chris Farley, or we think of whoever. But it's not it's a disease that people struggle with. And I don't think there's enough attention that's given to it to really address the problem. There's health insurance, there's government, there's a lack of research, there's a lack of knowledge, and hopefully we'll get better.
All right, Professor Sean Hartig, thank you for your time.
All right, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
This episode is supported in part by Athletic Greens. Their main product, AG1, is a comprehensive and convenient daily nutrition product containing 75 vitamins, minerals, and whole food sourced ingredients with less than 1 gram of sugar per serving, no nasty chemicals or artificial anything. It's gluten and dairy free and compatible with paleo, vegan, vegetarian, and ketogenic diets. AG1 is a quick and convenient way to supplement your diet to help ensure your body is getting the nutrients it needs. It comes in powder form, and you can mix it in water and drink it, or you can put it into a smoothie or a shake or something like that. I mix it into water and drink it, and it's super convenient. If you go to athleticgreens.com/mindandmatter, Athletic Greens will give you a free 1-year supply of vitamin D and 5 free travel packs with your first purchase. Their vitamin D product comes in tincture form, so you just take 1 drop each day. A large fraction of the population is actually vitamin D deficient, especially in winter months when we get less sun exposure. And vitamin D is super important for the proper function of the immune system and for a variety of other things. So visit athleticgreens.com/mindandmatter or click the link in the episode description. You'll get a free 1-year supply of vitamin D with your first purchase.